mighty and highly
Not too
honored.
mighty. Great, I'll accept that.
And the highly honored, deservedly honored at the far end. Let's start there.
Introduce yourself.
You'd like to introduce yourself?
Introduce myself. Well, if you've read Logan's Run or heard about it, then you know me because I wrote Logan's Run. I also wrote 100 other books that nobody can ever remember. This woman comes up to me and she says, Mr. Nolan, I'm a big fan of yours. I love your work. And I said, oh, gee, that's nice to hear. And she said, oh yeah, you're just so good. And I said, what have you read of mine? She said, well, I read Logan's Run. Have you ever written anything else?
I'm Alan Russell. I guess I don't know name tags, so I'll have to remember the name. I've written 16 mysteries in my name. I've written another dozen ghostwritten stories. I don't have movie stories to tell. I have a lot of failed. Most of these books here have been optioned for film. We'll talk about that later.
My name is Jonathan Mayberry. I'm a multi-genre writer. I write mystery, science fiction, horror, thrillers, comics for a bunch of different companies. And I have a bunch of oddball Hollywood stories. I've got one thing actually now in post-production, TV series for Netflix called V-Wars, which is a science fiction take on vampires. And it'll debut this fall, first season. And a whole bunch of other things, cooking and including, and some disaster stories, which explains why writers drink.
My name is David Brin, and my greatest claim to fame is I'll be remembered as a neighbor of Alan Russell.
There we go. The only time we see one another is events like this.
We'll correct that. And I did my doctorate at UCSD here, and I was in a workshop with this fine gentleman, and that helped teach me everything I know. I've had a number of novels out, and one of them got Kevin Costnerized for your protection. And we can talk about that, and also the many, many, many nibbles and near misses.
My name is Greg Bear, and despite being a science fiction writer, I've been in Southern California long enough to dip into a lot of movie history over the last 30 years, sometimes from a fly's eye view on the wall, and so there's a lot of stories there. Not as many as Bill Nolan has, but I never got a movie made. I made a lot of money off of them trying to make movies. A lot of screenwriters made even more money, but those are many stories, so that's where we're at.
Why don't we make this a one that's led by questions? Because I think the inevitable things are going to come out, like how I feel about having been Costnerized. Certainly, why don't we start with Bill, because he has some very interesting stories about his experiences.
Yeah, well, you know, Hollywood is, nobody will ever write the ultimate book on Hollywood because it's too crazy. I get this call from this guy and says, Bill, you're Bill Nolan? I said, yeah. Said, well, we want you to write our next Zorro story. And I said, well, what is that? They said, well, CBS is, they want to do a Zorro thing, The Adventures of Zorro, but they don't want to call him Zorro, they want to call him something else. Can you think of another name for him? And I said, how about the Nighthawk? Oh, he makes an N on the wall instead of a Z. Oh, that's great, that's great. In Hollywood, everything is either great or it's shit. And this is great, and we just love it. Now, you got to give him a big black horse to ride, just like Zorro had. I said, okay, I got that. You got to give him a mute Indian companion. I said, oh, okay, we got a mute Indian in there. And you got to give him a big stiff hat to wear on top that's black, and a mask and everything, and he has to carry a sword right with him in the saddle. I said, I got all that, man. I will give you Zorro under the name of the Nighthawks. So I write a thing called The Nighthawk Rides. It's a full script finally, because I got to go ahead to go to script based on some ideas I had. So The Nighthawk Rides, and everybody reads it at the network, CBS, everybody reads it. Silence. A week goes by, silence. Another week goes by, silence. Finally, I call the network. I say, what's happened to my script? Oh, we just love your script. Oh, Jesus, it's great. Well, when are you going to produce it? Well, we're not going to produce it. Why not? too much like Zorro. That's a true story. Anyway, let me make one quick comment. I would turn it over to the other gentleman. Writing for the screen, you've got to remember one thing. I wrote for the screen for 33 years. I did 40 scripts, and I did a lot of stuff. You got to realize that when you work in the realm of scripts, you lose the interior that you can give your character when you're doing prose. When you're doing prose, you can go into the mind of the character. Well, he thought maybe I should go into the door. Well, I better not go in there. In screenwriting, you have one thing. You have visuals and you have audio. You got to work within those two frameworks, and you can't go beyond them. And so I learned to do that very early. So anyway, here we go with the rest of the panel.
I thought I'd tell one horror story. My novel Saint Nick, before it was even in book form, I had submitted it to my film agent, and later we might talk about how that's changed and now their management companies and showrunners and everything else. But my film agent got it, really liked it, put it in the right hands, and I got a call from my film agent, and he said, "It's a done deal. We're going to be making this movie. Here's the terms of the contract. I'll be FedExing you the script, the signed contract." And I said, "It's great. I mean, it just sounded like the dream come true. Finally."
Great.
Thank you. And so then I told my wife, family. The next day, my wife awakened me in the early morning. She said, "Alan, was that contract dependent on the actor?" And I said, "Yeah. That's why they say it's going to be green lit. Everything was dependent on him starring, producing, directing." And then I just looked at her expression and I said, "Don't tell me John Ritter died." He died the day he was supposed to sign the contract and do whatever. I've had a lot of stories like that. That's the worst story. My son's in the audience. The familial shorthand for anything bad happening is John Ritter in our family ever since then.
So apparently I'm sitting next to the angel of death.
Yes.
I had two back-to-back horror stories with Hollywood. My first brushes with them before good things happened. First is when I was living back in Pennsylvania, I became friends with a woman who was an Emmy Award-winning TV writer. And we cooked up something called On the Slab, which was a web show for horror, science fiction, fantasy, entertainment news, books, comics, TV, whatever. And we pitched it to this division of Disney. And they loved it, they bought it, they had us do the Bible for how the thing should be run. Everything was going great, and then that executive got fired for something unrelated to that, and then the new guy came in, just got rid of every project, I mean, the check cleared, so yay, but at the same time, it was dead in the water, and it'll never be produced. I mean, it's done, it didn't belong to that guy. The second thing is, my first thriller, which was actually my fourth novel, my first thriller, Patient Zero, was optioned by Michael DeLuca at Sony, and then they took it to ABC for a primetime television drama. They did a script. They hired Javier Guerrero and Mark Swasher to do a fantastic script. They had Jeremy Renner and Kate Beckinsale lined up to star in it, and unfortunately also Kevin Spacey. Back when we all liked Kevin Spacey, we're all lined up to star in it. And the president of ABC just had to make a decision between that or the remake of Charlie's Angels. And they did that, and that lasted 3 episodes. Killed his career. He got fired over the Charlie's Angels thing. But then the show was dead. That version of the show was dead. And when something is not picked, even if it's picked for something, not picked for some stupid reason, it's considered a failing show. It took 10 years, and then the management at Sony is completely different now. And the Sony TV people came in and optioned it again, and now it looks like we're getting ready to hire a screenwriter, and we have some actors interested in. Nobody's talking about what happened 10 years ago. But those are my first two things. And I get an email every once in a while from Jeremy Renner, who says, I was looking at that old script, I think we should just cry a little bit. I'll drink a glass at my end, you drink a glass at your end, and we'll just toast each other. It would have been a starring TV show for him, which he had never had, still has not had.
Yeah, the thing to remember, how many of you have ambitions to actually go into that field, into that town?
Which
Hollywood. I grew up in that town. I went to LA High, the same as Ray Bradbury.
You recommend a hazmat suit? Is that
This is not a wise career path. It's if you are lucky, they pin you down, rip open your chest, tear out your beating heart,
If you're lucky.
stomp on it, do other things to it, and then if you're really, really lucky, they stuff it full of money and sew it back in your chest.
And then they invite you to the premiere.
And then they invite you. And that's if you are supremely lucky. Of course, everybody, I had an A-list thing that probably history will show that the most significant, memorable aspect to the Postman was that it was probably the worst case of timing of release in the history of all cinema and all forms of art. Coster said, I was barely on, I was treated fairly shabbily for no reason that I could ever figure out. I was a team player, I helped promote it. But he exchanged maybe 12 words with me over the course of the entire time, never bought me a beer. You'd think someone makes a movie of your book, you'd think they'd take you out for dinner.
In Hollywood?
Oh, no.
You're just the writer.
There are really good stories. And as we circle around to get, again, I'll tell you about the story of how Kinsella was treated on Field of Dreams. That is the opposite. But, that doesn't matter to me so much. If you weigh the things that are positive and negative, he was an asshole to me, but Hollywood does that to people, and I've met worse assholes.
In what field?
Even in science.
I see in science, that'd be.
Yeah.
this present company not included?
On the other hand, he gave me something to say to people in airports.
Which you did every single day.
And now, as far as the quality of the film is concerned, he scooped out and threw away all the brains from my book, and I think he hurt us all by the fact that it was his second film directing, and he said, I'm an Academy Award-winning director, I don't need advice. Whereas with Dances with Wolves, he was scared, and he sought a lot of advice. So the last 20 minutes of The Postman was incoherent mishmash that makes no logical sense.
Better than Waterworld.
better than Waterworld.
There's no question because of the other factors, and that is that he was utterly faithful to the heart of my book. The heart is absolutely there, and for that, what can I do but forgive? I mean, his main character is my main character with 80 fewer IQ points. The meaning, the message, the anti Mad Max notion. And by the way, all three of the first Mad Max movies were anti-Mad Max movies. If you actually watch them, they violate the so-called Mad Max cliche. He actually misses civilization, and others other than him matter.
A kind Max doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't. But most people who use that as the term for the cliche for that kind of film are talking about something that's more like this absolute wretched horror of called Fury Road that raped every single aspect that was good about the Mad Max universe. No, he was. What's there is the notion that civilization can only be saved by citizens. And the hero's duty is to just remind people that they were once such magical beings called citizens, and that it's within their power. And that's there. It's there. So you add one last factor, and that is that we were cursed by Kevin Costner being pretty. If he had been pig ugly, we would have gorgeous movies, because I think his real gift is as a cinematographer. I think that musically and visually, The Postman is one of the most gorgeous films ever shot. So, you have gorgeous, big-hearted, and dumb. Well, that's what my wife married. So, you know.
How's your music?
Yeah.
All right, I did one last thing, and that is that everybody talks about the screenplays that were buried because of the psychology of Hollywood producers. The production company cannot let anybody see the works that were in progress when the guy took over. So he buries them as deep as they can. There are safes, there are rooms with multiple combination locks and iris sensors, and inside of that is probably the greatest storehouse of human creativity, creative works that are banned from us ever seeing. And if I were a state legislator, one of my once per year crackpot bills would be to get all of that work liberated at least as literature. Because then they could have little amateur animated storyboards made of them and perhaps have a chance of life.
Didn't Faulkner start typing boy meets girl, boy marries girl, boy lives happily ever after? Supposedly it might be an apocryphal story, but his experience in Hollywood wasn't great as I understand it.
Actually, he said he wrote a letter to the director, or the producers, because he was hired as a writer at Warner Brothers, and working with Lee Brackett on one project. But at one point he says, "Do you guys mind if I write from home?" And they says, "No, that's okay." So he went back to Oxford, Mississippi. And he was happy there after.
Oh, your turn.
Well, the real secret about Hollywood is, or any filmmaking thing, is it's a highly paid attention deficit disorder city. That is, everything flocks on social relationships and money. And if you've been famous or you've gotten famous, there's a lot of people flocking around you to either have you make a movie or make a movie of your life. And that's kind of how it works. And if you happen to have a moment in the sun with a book that is highly popular, or a famous person who likes to make the book and so on, then you have a career. But I want to go back to the beginning of my relationship in Hollywood, getting the first story meetings and so on, which would be back around '77 after Star Wars. I was writing for the LA Times calendar section, and they assigned me to write a kind of historical analysis of science fiction as it related to Star Wars. And we got a great illustration and a full page spread, and I wrote about science fiction and how Star Wars had its roots in science fiction, and named names and all that kind of stuff, and very much appreciated the movie. Suddenly I started getting phone calls. I didn't have an agent, but I started getting phone calls. Studios that wanted me to explain to them why they had rejected Star Wars. And that was the beginning of it. But around that same time, a friend of mine named Rick Sternbach was doing illustrating work for Disney for a project called Space Probe 1. And he was feeding me kind of little bits and pieces. Probably he should have been arrested for doing that. But he was feeding little bits and pieces, and they didn't know what they were doing over there. They were really kind of fum-fawing with their script. And one of the script had lines, some of which ended up in the final film. One of the lines was, "We are searching for habitable life forms." Wow. And also, they didn't seem to know what a black hole was. Well, I'd done paintings and written stories about it, so I called up and got an appointment at Disney, and suddenly got to see the old Disney and all of the old Disney stuff. The people who had worked with Disney, the people, Peter Ellenshaw Sr., all that sort of stuff were there. And I took meetings with them, and it was just an astonishing moment. And I saw Peter Ellenshaw in his office, and he was working on the design of the spaceship that would be in this final film, and it was gorgeous. And there was, we were still trying to decide what the robot should look like, and it was just an amazing thing. And then later, I didn't hear from them, so I called the studio back, and Ron Miller, the director of the studio, answered the phone. That's the first time in my experience that the studio director actually answers the phone. But it was an astonishing, kind of almost like a family moment of the old family. And eventually, they never called back and never gave me a job. I handed them a copy of Galaxy magazine with my story in it. The movie was called The Black Hole. And it was their attempt to do what Star Wars had done, and the poor screenwriter had written westerns. He really didn't know what he was doing. They didn't know what a black hole was or what to do with it. And the acting, good actors, good cast, but they don't write scripts, and they're not allowed to change things much. And that movie sunk like a rock.
I saw it.
Yeah, yeah.
And now you've got the damn song in my head.
Da, 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 da.
Thank you.
Da, da,
Thank
da.
you.
Wait, can I ask, the Black Hole also has the distinction of being Disney's first ever PG movie.
That's true.
They transitioned from the G movies to PG, the PG level. Do you think that deviation from what Disney had done so successfully may have had an impact as well as the fact that...
No, they were hoping for a more adult audience. That's what they were hoping for.
They should have gone straight to
You
X.
should be.
Yeah, they should. Well, as I say, they had a good cast. They could have done that. But the one thing
You
is,
should be grateful
But
that
family friendly.
making a black hole purple.
yeah, the black hole was a bathtub drain going around.
Yeah.
And I had a much more interesting vision of a black hole, but that would have required better special effects. Still, there is one moment of the film that is pure genius. And that is they have the character, Maximilian Schell. You have the robot named Maximilian.
Yes.
And in the end, they pull back from Maximilian in hell, and inside him is Maximilian Schell. So you have Maximilian Schell in Maximilian's shell in hell. And nobody noticed this, but it's like the most brilliant meta type moment in science fiction cinema. And that is a real scene. If you watch the movie, they've amended it since. There's about 10 minutes that's been cut of that last sequence, because they actually had, before that happens, you have the good guys ending up in the Sistine ceiling, and you have the bad guys ending up in hell. They cut the Sistine ceiling part.
I think Bill, I'd like to hear if you were happy with Logan's run and your memories.
Well,
That's a cool story.
I'll tell you about Logan's Run.
Oh, boy.
Logan's Run came out from Dial Press in 1967, and it sold fairly well. They printed 5,000 copies, and they sold out, but they didn't do a reprint. So I thought, well, that's the end of Logan's Run. Meanwhile, Logan's Run was picking up a cult following that I knew nothing about. A lot of people loved it, and when it came out, they wrote great reviews of it and everything, and I thought, well, maybe it's going to work after all. I thought I'd make a couple of $100 out of it. I've made over $1 million from it, well over that. Anyway, so I had a friend named Ray Russell. He was fiction editor of Playboy magazine. And he wanted to come out to Hollywood and do some script writing. He did Mr. Sardonicus. He came out, they brought him out, and he paid for his way, and he wrote Mr. Sardonicus, and the damn thing got produced. So suddenly he's on the way, and then they said, let's get Ray Russell in here to write a picture. So Universal called Ray Russell, so Russell shows up for the meeting, and he sits down, and they said, now, here's the problem. How do we steal Logan's Run? See, you got to realize Hollywood has no moral base whatsoever. They will do anything to make money. And they'll rape your sister. They'll do anything to make money. And it's hard to reach these people. Getting something produced to me is like trying to talk to Louis B. Mayer on the telephone during the MGM years. You're going to get about 20 people in front of. Well, he's busy. He's in a meeting. They're always in a production meeting. No matter when you call, they're in a production meeting. Okay, I'm going to skip around a lot because I have dozens of boring stories about Hollywood that I can tell you.
They're great.
I wrote 40 scripts. I knew this one writer. He lived in a very nice condo, and he wore Italian suits, $500. And I said, man, you're doing fine. What do you do? And he said, oh, I just write for Hollywood. I don't do books or stories or anything. I just write. He said, I make a lot of money. And I said, yeah, well, what have you had produced? He said, produced? I've never had anything produced. I live on the option money that they pay me. It's very good money, and I can live like a king on the option money. They've optioned 12 of my books already. Produced? Someday I might get something produced. I don't think so. And I realized that I've been very lucky because I wrote 40 scripts over my 33 years in Hollywood, and half of them were produced and half of them weren't. And the ones that were not produced were every bit as good as the ones that were, because Hollywood has no standard whatsoever. Whatever works for them is something they think they can make more money on. And I'll give you one short example, and then I'll turn it back to the gentleman here. I came on, they've been trying to make a remake on Logan's Run at Warner Brothers for over 20 years. And finally, a couple of years ago, somebody said, I think I have the answer to how to make the remake on Logan's Run. And I said, well, how do we do it? And they said, we turn Logan into a woman. And I said, what? Morgana's Run? And they said, yeah, you see, in the Hunger Games, it's the woman character that carries the movie. We'll make Logan a woman, and that'll solve everything. I said, no, it doesn't solve anything. I said, not only not everything, it doesn't. Wouldn't even know how to do that. Well, we don't use you anyway. You're too close to the material. I said, well, yeah, I wrote it. I mean, yeah, I can't help that. I'm sorry about that. So I have dozens of stories about Hollywood, and people say to me, tell the mummy story, the mummy story. Maybe I'll tell the mummy story later in the panel, but right now let the other gentleman speak.
Well, whenever anyone ever questions your integrity for letting your books go to Hollywood, and they say it's tainted money, I always say it tain't enough. Especially now, because like for a couple of my more recent books, The Homecoming, I was represented by CAA, and you used to be able to make a fairly good living on option money.
That's right.
But now they're really cutting that out. Again, I alluded to managers and showrunners. Well, now film agents, what used to be film agents, like to call themselves producers. So again, the option money that used to come your way, I had a very famous producer trying to do this. Did he give me any money recently? No. Again, an even probably more famous producer trying to do Burning Man, the whole series, as a limited series, and they managed to get the product in for a year, saying that this will come at the back end of it. I used to like the old days when money came at the front end of it. I think everyone here will probably attest to the fact that I think writers in the new system of Hollywood probably get screwed out more than anyone else.
So I've got a slightly different take on the Hollywood thing, in that I'm actually enjoying the process right now.
It won't last.
So they tell me, but for right now, and I'm keeping my day job of writing novels. I'm actually not yet writing any of my stuff for Hollywood. It's being adapted by other people. When V-Wars was a series of comics done by I did for IDW here in town, and also a 4 prose shared world anthologies where I wrote the framing story. And when they bought it for Netflix, they bought the framing story and my comics, which was interesting. So they bought my version of the story, and they've included me in every step of it, which is fun. I know there has been a change in Hollywood recently where the writer is finally starting to get a little respect. It isn't across the board yet, but it's. I heard so many horror stories about the writer being marginalized or locked in a closet or taken out in the woods and shot, rather than letting them anywhere near the set. But I've been seeing, since I'm relatively new to Hollywood, seeing a different version of it, where this was shot. We were shot in Canada. They flew me up there. My wife and my son. They flew us up there for the table reads, for much of the shoot. They've actually had me Skype into the writers' room a few times, even though I'm not writing the show. They've had me Skype in so the writers can ask me questions. And I told my agent that. She's like, "And what drugs did you take right before you thought that happened?" Because it's pretty rare to include the writer, and I don't know why I got included. Probably because I'm not a prima donna, and I don't tell people they have to put every word of my books on screen, which is impossible anyway. A book and an adaptation cannot be exactly the same.
Unless it's The Expanse.
Yeah. Well, but even some of that they left behind, which I wish they hadn't. So they're doing an adaptation. They're doing a version of it that is not exactly with my book. But here's the thing: they had a line producer go through the V Wars material and budget out what 10 episodes would cost. And my story, I mean, especially when I'm writing a comic or a prose, I can have whole cities blow up. I can have 40,000 people involved in a riot or something. It's a little expensive to shoot that. So they had to change things to make it affordable. And they made some interesting changes, and they covered them. They went over them with me. They're not contractually obligated to, but they did anyway. They wanted my blessing. The actors have been Skyping me or contacting me through social media to ask about their characters. It's an experience that goes contrary to what all of my friends in Hollywood have gone through, and I don't know whether it's because I sacrificed to the right elder gods, but it's working. And there's also something, the expression, nothing succeeds like success. So you get one thing, and then all the other projects which have been laying fallow that haven't gotten hot suddenly become attractive. So since then, I've sold, I've had 7 other options, and the option money jumped up from the original option money, which was, here's some pocket change, to, here, this will make you happy. And so the option money's coming up too. I don't know exactly why it is. My agent has something to do with it, I'm sure. I think not being a jackass has something to do with it, which I try not to be.
Thanks a lot.
But also, there's No, I'm talking about what's happening in the moment in Hollywood. It is slightly changing. I have a number of friends who have had very successful shows. George R. R. Martin, Charlene Harris with True Blood, Jeff Lindsay with Dexter, and seeing how they react, like who's really welcome on the set and who's kind of not, has a lot to do with in today's world with how you react to people. And so I'm trying to still be the happy kid in the playground, because I'm generally the happy guy, and it's working. And if it stops working at some point, I will be very surprised and very unhappy, but right now it seems to be working, and I keep getting invited to different, like for example, Sony's now doing developing my Joe Ledger series for cable. So every time they interview a writer, they have me come up and sit in on the interview when the producers are talking to, the executive talking to potential writers for the show.
Now that's amazing.
That's really weird.
That's like being allowed in casting calls.
Yeah, mind you, they don't encourage me to talk that much. I'm there to answer questions, but I get to meet the writers, and then they talk to me afterwards about my take on it. And since I know this is not typical Hollywood, so I'm hoping this is an indication of how the Hollywood is starting to change and maybe get its head out of its ass as much and respect the writer, because respecting the writer would be a novel take for Hollywood. So that's where I am right now with it.
Well, the one thing you have to learn about Hollywood is creative input is a highly desirable commodity that they do not pass out freely. So if you are at a key point, like a director, a major screenwriter, they may or may not have, the director will have creative input unless the producer is bigger than the director. But that's really an important thing, and they do not parcel that out without major reasons to do so. So you think of Anne Rice on Interview with the Vampire. She didn't like the casting at all. She thought they'd be terrible. They really had a problem with her until they showed her some dailies, and then she realized, wait, Brad Pitt is pretty good. He does kind of fit this. He can do this. And to be a really hardcore, she was of course a major bestseller. She caused them a lot of trouble. They do not pass this out, this kind of power out, easily.
Yeah, you raise so many issues. One is that TV versus film are very different, and TV is becoming more powerful, and most of the people in Hollywood, in film, almost anybody you meet in film, the odds of you rolling up anybody but a jerk is very, very low. Now, or anybody who understands the story, in TV, all the powerful people were once writers before cocaine and power and sex and all those things. But there are glimmers of a former writer somewhere buried deep down under the powerful people in TV, and TV is starting to become the tail that wags the dog. I was mentioning timing, and this is one reason why I'm still wheel spinning instead of being somebody who's a famous deliverer of product, is that the Postman was an epic fail. More so than it deserved, partly because Costner had offended almost everybody in town. But the epic fail was not helped by being the worst timing release in the history of all art. He sent around an email in 1997, and yes, there was email in 1997, Virginia. And it said, we've got it made this Christmas release. I expect this gentleman here to burst out in laughter. This Christmas release in 1997, because our only competition is James Cameron's silly remake about a sinking boat. So
Was that any good, that one?
timing. Now, there are some things that I think would make the writer more powerful, and I hinted at it when I spoke about releasing the prisoners from those vaults, and that is technology. All of the technologies are here now for a product that the pieces are all there, and one company could put it all together, but nobody has. And I think powers in Hollywood don't want it put together, and that is the animated storyboard. Now, the director would look at it as a director's tool. You map out every scene and you time it out, and it's animated, so it's not just a storyboard. Every beat is there. Every spoken piece of dialogue, you can time it out. The producer would look at it as a production tool, but try to envision stick figures moving around the full 90 minutes, the full 2 hours, voice actors doing all the lines and all the beats, and a simple keyboard music behind it. You've got maybe 5 people, an expert in the program, the writer, a good photographer, and a musician.
$4 million.
No, you're forming a team.
Yeah, but you got $4 million.
No. This team does this on spec because they're a team and they believe in the project and what
How
they
many
do.
of those projects you want to do?
Because what you do is these things are self-supporting. There's a whole YouTube-style industry of these things that get their own following. And the 120-page script that everybody treats with contempt dies and is replaced by this. What you do is, before you even sign anything with the studio, you've got something that's a much better dry run of the film. And if the studio head says, well, we'd like to change this and this and this, you can answer, I'll be back with your changes in a week, and we'll run them, your version and my version, in front of test audiences. What you're talking about is a situation that is going to, over the long run, when this thing really is out there, it's going to empower the writer. And it's going to have its own following. And you think about it, you've had this experience. If stick figures are doing the dialogue with the right beats and the right music in the background, you will weep. You will identify with stick figures and you will weep because you're capable of that. So I think that's going to make a huge difference in this whole business of us interacting with powerful mega producers.
It'll actually be the step up from what's been working for Hollywood a lot right now. Is one of the reasons they option graphic novels and comics so much because everything's storyboarded, and a good artist has the characters act when they draw. That's what, but the animated storyboard would be a really nice touch. I'd love to see that. I would actually subscribe to that as a TV show. I'd like to watch it every week.
Yeah, all of us here have scripted graphic novels, and it is like being the director of a film, because you're writing the film, but you're all writing it down to the level of camera angles. Yeah. So each of us has some experience with that. That's
Oh, well, I think it's a fun idea. The stick figures probably wouldn't work, but they call it animatics in filmmaking, and they do animatics, certainly if there's a heavy special effects component to the film, but also major directors will do animatics. Secret Winter, for example, has on the DVD an extra that shows you the animatic that the director did, and he scripts the entire thing visually. And so you take these animatics, and if you look at Jurassic Park and the extras, there's also an animatic of the animation sequences, which is actually stop motion animation.
Right.
And
That was Tippett.
Tippett had his people do it, but there's many stories behind Jurassic Park which are utterly terrifying.
Speaking
and
about that animatics, I think that Disney, or maybe it was Microsoft, was working on a way of doing a frame, like a middle frame and an end frame
Yeah.
of a character's expression,
Right.
and it just fills it in.
In between, yeah, and that, of course, was a major function of all animation studios, is the people who did the in-betweens. Someone like Chuck Jones would do the major frames, and then everyone else would fill it in, and they had like legions of women in back rooms.
Now they can do it.
Right.
Right now, the new NVIDIA hardware lets them do that with the tensor cores.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have questions.
No, I was just gonna say too, you were talking about the audiences who would like to see that. There's been a movement a few years ago in taking video game characters, which are already pre-rendered, and scripting them. I forget the.
Machinima.
Yeah, exactly.
Machinima.
So that's.
Well, they have the
already
software. They actually have movement software for these characters, and I thought about that years ago when trying to figure out how you could sell dinosaurs. Is you just build up the dinosaurs as animatics or in CGI as machinima, and then you got all the moves, and that's how a lot of television shows in the science area are made right now.
We just do
Oh
everything
boy,
as default.
Master Chief gets to have some K&S sex scenes.
That's right. Slash dinosaur stuff.
Oh, we're talking Master Chief's master here.
No. It's,
Just a comment, but I could remember at the very first El Cortez Comic-Con, sitting at the pool at night, and Jack Kirby said to a bunch of us kids sitting around, he says, "Boys, this is gonna be the biggest thing in the world. Hollywood's at our feet. We've got, everything's already storyboarded. All they've gotta do is film it." And we all looked at him like, "Gee, Mr. Kirby, could that be right?" And right he was.
Yeah, and there's a new component in this cross-platform stuff too. Web comics, webtoons. Recently, the first book in this series was purchased for webtoons, where it's a serial comic book adaptation of your book, but it also forms a nice storyboard. And a day after we announced that we're doing the webtoons, a film company offered us kind of an obscene amount of money to buy the film rights of it, because they might want to produce either a film or an anime that goes off the webtoon adaptation. It's like, sure, that sounds fun. I don't have to do any work for that. But the webtoon allows them to, essentially somebody's storyboarding it for you via subscription comic book for your phone. It's like, when I first started writing, that didn't even sound like a sentence that made sense.
Yeah.
And now it's a thing. So, big fan.
Just a quick, Greg, you had some stuff done for TV, didn't you? A new Twilight Zone?
I only had one dramatization, which was 85 Twilight Zone. They did a story called Dead Run, which was great fun to watch it happen. But until that, there was a lot of option money. And then finally in 2002, there was a huge bundle of option. Studio executive fell in love with Forge of God and said, "You will be happy," to my agent at that time. And that allowed my agent and the agency he was working in to continue for a number of years. And for me, it was great, but they never made the movie. Turned out the screenwriter had some limitations on what they could do to bring in other screenwriters. And no director would sign on to that, because every director brings in their own screenwriter, every major director, or they want to rewrite it themselves. And he wouldn't allow that, so that stopped that from happening. The end result, though, was that my agency, my agent and his agency, went on to do Game of Thrones. They developed Game of Thrones, and suddenly they all became fabulously wealthy, and George became even more wealthy. And then the spin-offs made them even wealthier. And right now, George is building a theater.
He's moving on to bigger projects.
He's got this whole theater that he's working on. Says, one way to make a big fortune in making a movie theater is to start with a small fortune. or make a small fortune to start with a big fortune. So,
There were no animated primetime television series in the 1980s when Fox, which at the time was a new network trying to gain a foothold with the established three, accepted Matt Groening's animated series about the Simpson family. Does the idea of going with a less prestigious studio or other entity and helping to build them have advantages and disadvantages in terms of various?
depends on how good they are. And if you're dealing with a new line, New Line started off small, and so did HBO as a network. They did wrestling matches and stuff. And so you stick around long enough, and if the talent moves into that area and has an idea, then you ride on their particular horse for a while, or the wagon that they're dragging behind them.
Use Roger Corman's method.
Yeah. Roger Corman is an amazing survivor in Hollywood, and he's still alive. So.
Yes.
How about the idea, or after listening to this, the myth of creative control? Can such a thing be had?
Well, I'll be very brief on it because my experience is less than these chaps. With V-Wars, I don't have by contract creative control, but they've invited me in. With everything we've sold since, my agent, I'm with CAA, my agent has built into every option agreement executive producer credit, and a measure explicitly drafted a measure of creative input and creative control. So now, because I have a success to build on, I was able to ask for that and get it. Now mind you, it was a knife fight sometimes, but I was able to get it. I don't know how much that will be. Like, I've got one thing in development for film, the rest is for TV. I don't know how good that's going to play out, how much control I'm actually going to have. I'm not going to expect to go in there and be able to call the shots. But these guys have had more experience with that in practical.
Well, if they like you and you're good at what you do, you won't be invited back into the story room. I mean, that's all there is to it. If they don't like you for whatever reason, you will not get invited back.
Bill, you have
Likability is required.
I know, it's a hard bar.
with Dan Curtis. You had a lot of creative
Well,
control.
yeah, creative control is very rare in Hollywood. They don't like to give you creative control. They want the creative control based on how much money they're willing to pay you. And they're always trying to buy you off. And it's like living in the land of Oz or something, working in Hollywood. It's like living in Wonderland. I did an essay on writing for Hollywood, and I called it Life in the Rabbit Hole. Because you follow the rabbit into this hole, and this hole is called Hollywood. But to answer your question, yeah, you can get creative control if you're important enough writers. Stephen King gets creative control because he's Stephen King, because he's got this track record. They'll very reluctantly give it to you if they have to, but they don't like it.
But you had a lot of leeway with Dan Curtis.
I was lucky enough to work with a producer, creative director named Dan Curtis, and most of my credits are thanks to Dan. He would set the whole thing up at the network before he ever called me, and then the phone would ring, and I'd say hello, and he'd say, "Is this a ghost who walks like a man?" Because that's what he called me. I would come very late at night and leave scripts against his door, and he called me the ghost who walks like a man, and I said, "Yes, it is. This is a ghost." And he said, be in my office at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We got a movie of the week to write. So he'd have it all set up. It's wonderful. And I'd have creative control because he respected my writing and used me again and again and trusted my writing, trusted my dialogue. So I was very lucky to have him in my life.
So the writer is usually the necessary evil, but sometimes, perhaps it's right. I know King hated The Shining, which I think is a great film.
And we have, by the way, 5 minutes, so last couple questions.
Oh, that Kinsella story I promised. Phil Eldon Robinson treated Joe Kinsella in Field of Dreams so terrifically, and he swoops into Kinsella's driveway in his sports car, leaves the motor running, pounds on Kinsella's door, and Kinsella comes to the door and says, "Phil, what's the matter?" And he says, I've been good to you. Yes, yes, beyond all my expectations. Well, you owe me. Yes, anything. Come with me. We have a fight on our hands at the studio. Oh, what is it? What is it? He's getting into the car and he says, the studio, they wants to change you the title of your wonderful novel from Shoeless Joe to some Field of Dreams crap. Kinsella reaches over, turns off the engine of the sports car, pulls Phil Alden Robinson out of the car, brings him into the house, sits him down, pulls out of a drawer a giant sheaf of papers, plops it in front of him. It says, Dreamfield. My publisher made me change it. At which point Phil Alden Robinson says, so what's for lunch? Fairy tales can come true, it can happen to
We
you.
have time for one last question.
I want to hear the mummy story.
The mummy story. Bill's being interviewed at 3 p.m.
Oh,
Don't tell the mummy
I
story.
don't have time for the mummy
3
story.
o'clock, Bill's being
But
interviewed.
in the interview I'm going to be doing with Jason, I'm going to tell a mummy story later today.
I'll make sure of it.
So, one last thing, I got this from one of the top people in movies. He says, every single project I've been involved in, I've had to quit halfway through. Every single project. This is Jim Cameron.
Wow.
And can you imagine quitting on Titanic halfway through until they give you the money you need to finish it the way you want to do it? But also, can you imagine waiting around to think whether $220 million is about to go down the bucket? You know, this stuff is scary. It takes a particular kind of personality to survive at that level. Friend Phil Tippett once says, you know, if you make a film that costs more than $8 million, it's heart attack time. Under $8 million, you might survive.
Great. Now, before we take out of here, where are you guys next today?
I am on the Elon Musk panel at 1, and then we have a Killer Bees panel that will include
At 2 o'clock, yeah.
At 2 o'clock that will include, we hope, Werner Vinci.
Cool.
So everybody show up for Bill Nolan's wonderful interview
In this room.
In this room. At 3.
That's after us, so we're back here at 2 and he's there at 3.
All right.
And I have,
And get the books of these guys,
Yep.
Jonathan and Alan. Wonderful stuff. You will be transported, and you will keep food right next to where you're sitting, because you'll get
You'll be
bed
rooted to your
sores.
chair.
You'll get bed sores.
and if anyone's around at 4 o'clock, the Lunar Cafe, I'm doing just an interview thing. So, all right, thanks for coming out, guys. You guys